That does not mean, of course, we cannot apply our sanctions in such a way that they have these effects on those who are circumventing. So I think if you look at the 17th, 18th, and have a look at the 19th proposal we have made, you will see that the anti-circumvention focus has increased significantly over time.
Thank you for your questions. I'll probably start with the first one on enforcement. Unfortunately, the picture in the European Union on criminal enforcement of sanctions could be better. We saw that as soon as the transposition term for the directive on criminalizing sanctions violations was over, the Commission initiated infringement proceedings against some member states for not transposing the directive in time, which means potentially there is no criminal sanction for violation of EU sanctions in those member states. And we know that some member states have not reported any cases of sanctions violations, although we all know that they occur, either obfuscating trade with Russia and exporting or importing prohibited goods under different product codes, which are not sanctioned, or of course diverting trade through third countries, which are known as evasion jurisdictions, most particularly countries which are in the same economic and customs union as Russia. And this is by far the most common typology of sanctions violation that we have seen. However, there are also very good news. For example, the fact that the European Union has adopted the directive on criminalization of sanctions to make sure that there is the deterrent effect, because only through proper sanctions enforcement with criminal fines, with jail times, with huge confiscations, we can achieve a deterrent effect so that businesses and people who wish to violate sanctions and make money from that are held accountable. What also is being done for many types of goods is a transit prohibition through the Russian territory. For example, taking a Latvian example, we are in a unique geographic position bordering both Russia and Belarus. And for a long time, sanctions against Russia and Belarus were not aligned. And we really saw many cases each day where a truck was going to Russia. Our customs officers told us, you can't bring this goods to Russia. The truck turned around, went 100 kilometers below to Belarus border and easily imported those goods into Belarus. Under 14th sanctions package, I think in June, last June, a year before, 2024, both sanctions regimes against Russia and Belarus were aligned to a very large extent. So that's another very good move forward. Then the transit prohibition. As I said, Latvia being the external border country with Russia and Belarus, we see a lot of trade by other EU member states' jurisdictions, companies incorporated therein. The goods are intended for export to Kazakhstan, and later on we found out that they have ended up in Russia. For many goods, including dual-use goods, strategically significant goods, there is now a prohibition, for a long time, prohibition to even transit these goods through Russia. So for these critically significant goods that are important for Russia's military-industrial complex, this circumvention route really is very difficult to be used. Another part of enforcement, we believe it was raised by the European Parliament a while ago on vesting European Public Prosecutor's Office with the power to enforce sanctions on the EU level. In our opinion, that would be a very good move forward to make sure there is more coherence in enforcement. So all in all, to conclude, we believe that enforcement on the EU level must be better to create the deterrent effect, but we see very concrete, significant steps already taken on the EU level to make it better than it was in the beginning of the war. At the same time, it has been 3.5 years since the beginning of the war, and we don't hear a lot about very significant fines or criminal penalties for violation of sanctions, but we know they do occur. And as I said, in Latvia, we have over 600 criminal investigations currently on sanctions violations.
Thank you. For the S&D, Eroina Luoma.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And may I thank our experts for the valuable presentations. My group really welcomes the 19 sanction package presented by the Commission last week. And this time I would be a little bit positive. I would also acknowledge the creative way the Commission is trying to find new possibilities to make justice to Ukraine and make sure that the money, the Russian money which is in the European Union, could be used in a way to help Ukraine. The message from our side should be really clear that we will help Ukraine and we are ready to increase economic pressure on Moscow. And this is also a security question for us. Then around the Commission's latest plan for repatriation loan towards Ukraine, underpinned by frozen Russian assets, which is a really important thing, as has been mentioned here. My question is that with this construction Commission is proposing, the financial stability concerns as expressed earlier by the ECB, for example, are they sufficiently addressed, and if so, how exactly? And then my second question, how do you assess the threats of some Russian sources stating that the West's 285 billion in foreign direct investment in Russian economy could be at risk if Russia's assets were taken? And then my third question goes a little bit further. In July, we had a discussion on the possibilities to list Russia on the high-risk third country lists, and then Commission made a promise to the Parliament that they are preparing this decision, so I would be interested to hear which kind of progress you have made in preparing this decision.
Thank you. So, Commission.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the question. The ECB's concerns, I mean, they are not only the ECB's concerns, but they're the ones the ECB have been expressing, will be addressed, I think, by what the President has said, is that whatever we eventually propose to do will not affect the ownership of these assets. And what has been the ECB's major concern is that we will breach international law. So the idea here, and I don't want to go into too much detail because this is a proposal that's still under preparation, is that we can mobilize this money without affecting the ownership of the assets. So that will be in conformity with international law. And this is where the concern, and it's a concern we fully understand, about the possible implications for the international financial system and for the euro area financial system as part of that in particular, needs to be borne in mind. So the idea will be to mobilize these assets, but not in a way that affects the ownership of the assets, which is in fact is the point that the ECB is primarily and mostly concerned about. Your point on the possibility of retaliation, well, this is always there, and this is one of the things we have to bear in mind when we talk about this subject, that it's not just, how do I put it, an open and shut case. There are other considerations to be borne in mind. One is the concerns as expressed by the ECB and others, but the second is what Russia might do if we do this. So again, it is very important that we present the proposals in line with international law. So there is no excuse for anyone to take this retaliation because we have not actually breached international law. And then on the HRTC, yes, we are looking at building a case perhaps for a listing Russia. But we are where we were back then. We are trying to build the case. We're trying to put together the evidence. You will know, of course, that Russia has not been suspended from the FATF. It's been suspended in the FATF. It has not been taken out of the FATF. So there is still a problem of finding us the evidence we need to make the case to actually put them on the list for AML reasons. Okay. So this has to be a legally sound proposition for us. There has to be based on the AML framework and breaches of Russia of that framework. And that's what we're looking for now. But this, of course, is difficult to acquire this evidence. Or ordinarily you do on-site inspections and you see what's going on. That's not really a possibility at the moment. So we're trying to do this from remote. But we are working on it as we promised we would do. Thanks.
So we go to the next speaker, and this is Eniko Gyori for PFE.
Thank you, Chair. Well, our socialist colleague has just welcomed the creative way in imposing sanctions. I would rather warn you all what our Director General has just said. Whatever we do has to have a legal a sound legal basis. That's the key. We cannot afford doing things which do not respect our own acquis communautaire, international law, and I would also add our highest level political commitments. Because let me quote what was adopted by our heads of state and government in spring 2022 in Versailles, that whatever do with the sanction has to respect and taking into account national circumstances and member state choices of their energy mix. Because, dear colleagues, please be rational and use your cool head. Energy security is not just a political question, it's a physical question. It is determined by geographical position, interconnection, capacity of tubes, and prices. So, and this is a national competence in as far as EU regulations are concerned. Circumventing sanctions, as some do, and this is why the EU started to import much more LNG than before, because it is circumventing the sanctions, and I don't think that's the way forward, but let's have sanctions which work. My first question here is, from a legal point of view, how do you see that this new very creative idea to limit fossil fuel imports by increasing taxes when we are speaking about sanctions where you need unanimity, meanwhile for trade issues you only need qualified majority. And concerning the frozen assets issue, here again, cool head. We already have mechanisms in place which allow windfall profits stemming from Russia's central bank assets to be used without confiscation. Second, confiscation would damage the international role of the euro, even when President Lagarde has said we have a possible global euro moment. Third, and I will finish, it could result in invest in euro-dominated assets, higher longer-term financial costs for the EU, reduced. I already had my questions.
Yeah, please, because it's almost 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So I just warning that we really have to have very sound legal basis, whatever we do. Thank you for your patience. Thank you.
Commission.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the question. I think we are very conscious of the need for a sound legal basis for what we propose. I mean, one of the interesting features of sanctions in the European Union is it is so legally based. Everything is based in law. We are, because of that reason, we're quite a lot less flexible than our US partners, but that is the structure we have and we operate within it. So anything we put forward will be assessed for legal soundness. So on the LNG, yes, this is an approach. We have assessed it, it is legally sound. On the Russian assets, well, I think you have made the point, as others have made, this is a complicated discussion, okay? Because there is a sense of grievance on one side that would say that this justifies certain actions, but there is international law, so we need to be careful that we remain within international law. And that is what we're trying to do here with this proposal. What the President has promised to offer is a way in which we can mobilize the assets while remaining fully within international law. So it's clear from her statement, the ownership of the assets will not be touched. As I said, this is legally sound. I mean, this has been checked. It is legally sound and therefore, and has been, as I said, it is now under discussion with the Council and is, at least for the moment, accepted in the Council. Thanks.
Thank you. Do you want to answer?
I can only agree with Mr. Berrigan that I don't think there has ever been a case in the European Union where funds of any sanctioned person would have been confiscated just because of the fact that they are sanctioned, not even talking about a separate instrument which is not asset freeze, but immobilization of Russian sovereign funds. What we have done in Latvia, for example, in certain cases, frozen funds belonging to or owned or controlled by a designated Russian person have been confiscated where criminality has been proven, where the criminal origin of the funds was also proven, and then the funds can be confiscated through the country's criminal law measures or non-conviction-based confiscation schemes, which has been the case we have done, especially knowing that Russian organized crimes groups and oligarchs are using shell companies registered in offshore jurisdictions and in certain banking centers around the world. So in such cases where funds are frozen and there are suspicions of money laundering or other financial crimes occurring, only then they can be confiscated. But just because of the fact that somebody is sanctioned, I don't think there's ever been the case in the European Union that some of these funds were confiscated in the end. Thank you.
Thank you. For ECR, Marlena Malak.
Szanowni Państwo, bardzo dobrze, że Komisja wreszcie poważnie podchodzi do kwestii rezygnacji z rosyjskich paliw, proponując całkowity zakaz importu rosyjskiego LNG. Gorzej jednak jest w kwestii zamrożonych rosyjskich aktywów, bo tutaj nie widać szans na postęp. W tej sprawie, jak w soczewce, skupiają się wszystkie europejskie bolączki finansowe. I chyba najbardziej dobitnie widać tutaj rozdźwięk między ogromnymi aspiracjami a bardzo ograniczonymi możliwościami. Jak dotąd ponad 100 miliardów euro europejskich podatników zostało przekazanych na Ukrainę. Choć wartość rosyjskich aktywów zamrożonych w Unii Europejskiej jest dwukrotnie większa. I chociaż bardzo by nam się te środki przydały, boimy się jednak po nie sięgnąć. I tu jest pytanie, dlaczego? Po prostu jesteśmy po uszy zadłużeni. Nie chcemy wystraszyć potencjalnych pożyczkodawców. Wystarczy, że Chiny czy Arabia Saudyjska zagrożą wycofaniem się ze skupu europejskich obligacji państwowych i już musimy rezygnować z naszych ambitnych planów. Wielkie plany co do globalnego euro również zostałyby wtedy pogrzebane, gdyby tylko najwięksi gracze wycofali swoje inwestycje. Jest to jednak również prozaiczne i niesystemowe działanie, które jest związane z tym, że ciągle zaangażowanych jest w Rosji wiele europejskich firm, co dzisiaj już też padło, które mimo ostrzeżeń nie wycofują się z tego rynku. Ale trzeba zwrócić uwagę, że tylko w 2023 roku austriacki Raiffeisenbank, największy zachodni bank wciąż działający w Rosji, zgromadził 4,4 miliarda euro zysku. A więc zamiast buńczucznych haseł i zwalania winy to na Trumpa, to na Orbana, zastanówmy się lepiej, na co nas tak naprawdę stać, a na co nas po prostu nie stać i dlaczego. A przede wszystkim przestańmy wreszcie udawać gospodarcze mocarstwo. Dlatego moje pytanie brzmi, kiedy sięgniemy po zamrożone rosyjskie aktywa? Dlaczego tego nie robimy? Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the question. I find myself in a way just repeating my previous answer, but I'm happy to do so. We are aware of and the President is very aware of the demands on the one hand and the fiscal situation that Europe finds itself in on the other hand, which is why she has put forward this proposal to mobilize these assets, but to mobilize them in a way that is consistent with international law. We are working on that proposal now. We think it is possible to do so, and that will be, in a sense, answer the question that you've asked, that we will mobilize them, but we will remain consistent with international law, and therefore meet the Council conclusions and limit the risks that the ECB has identified in the past. In terms of companies still in Russia, it's important to note that from 2022, there were many, many companies that left Russia quite quickly. Some did not for a variety of reasons, and now I think find it increasingly less straightforward to exit Russia. It's not quite a straightforward process. But we are aware those companies are still there, and those companies are also aware of the risks they take by staying there. But as I said, it's not always so straightforward to exit at this point. But on the Russian assets, I will just repeat again, it is trying to balance these two constraints that that the President has put forward this proposal in the first place, that we need the money, but we also need to respect international law, and we think that we can meet both constraints. Thank you.
Next speaker for Renew, Billy Keller.
Thank you very much. Just to thank for the presentations and the answers to questions previously. I might be slightly repetitive, but I'll just try and take a different approach. I suppose I welcome the fact that at least we're looking at how we can leverage the sovereign assets that are frozen here in Europe from the point of view of insisting that if they are to be relinquished or returned, that they would be primarily put to use in terms of the reconstruction of Ukraine, or if they're not, if that's not agreed, that we would keep them confiscated and leverage them for the foreseeable future in the reconstruction of Ukraine itself. I suppose from my perspective, what I find very difficult to understand is, and I accept the validity of the argument around sovereign assets and international law, but if you look behind the scenes and deeper, there certainly is huge sums of Russian money, mainly oligarchs, swirling around Europe. And I find it very hard to believe that most of that isn't some form of criminality. Bear in mind that Russia is a criminal state. And the idea that an oligarch in Russia can make billions without some of it at least being some form of criminality is beyond belief. And I just do not think that we have made enough effort to look at Russian money, Russian assets, Russian properties owned by oligarchs and other named individuals, that we haven't done more to seize it. So I suppose the question really is, have the member states enough resources, capacity, capability in determining what is and what isn't, firstly, Russian assets, Russian money, and then the ability to confiscate that, and then to do a due diligence on where that money came from, because I just cannot accept that the amount of money seized so far is minuscule compared to what I believe is swirling around Europe in terms of Russian money or assets. So from that perspective, is the Commission satisfied that member states are doing enough? What more could they do? And is there enough effort between the new anti-money laundering agency and other agencies across Europe to help and support member states in doing an assessment of these assets and money?
Thank you. So, Commission.
Thank you. I mean, it's important just to recall what the objective of sanctions are. The objective of sanctions is to put pressure on the entities and the country on which the sanctions are imposed. They are meant, of course, to be reversible. Okay? So the sanctions law itself cannot confiscate. This is simply not within the logic of the law. It's not within the scope of the law. So as I said earlier, if you want to confiscate these assets, you need to prove criminality. And that requires due process. So it's not a question of whether we're happy or unhappy with the member states. It's the member states have to identify if this criminal behavior exists and then through due process prove it. And then, of course, they can confiscate the asset. I mean, I always feel a bit bad when I say this because it always sounds like we're ducking slightly, but we are not responsible for the implementation of sanctions. This is a national competence delivered to the national competent authorities. And we have seen good examples of national authorities that have done this. I think Latvia is one example of what has been done. So it's not a question of whether we're happy or not. We are not responsible for this. We cannot do it through the sanctions law. But we accept that confiscation of these assets requires proof of criminal behavior. We set up this freeze and seize task force, which was to help harmonize the approaches, use best practices, help member states to learn from each other. But in the end, this is something that member states need to do themselves. And we cannot have a view, if that criminality is not proven, then the sanctions law does not allow the confiscation of the assets. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Yankov, if you want to, no? Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, the question is mostly about the confiscation of assets from money laundering perspective, presuming that they are of criminal origin. And until recently, when the FATF, Financial Action Task Force, mandated under its recommendation for all countries in the world to establish so-called non-conviction-based confiscation systems, it is in practice extremely difficult for countries to confiscate funds of Russian oligarchs who are connected potentially to the government of that country. Because funds are usually confiscated through criminal proceedings, and criminal proceedings have very high standards of proof. And if there is a cross-border case, you would usually need to send a mutual legal assistance request to Russia, asking about whether the funds belonging to certain Russian oligarch are of criminal origin. You might not get an answer for many years, and maybe if you get an answer, potentially, because of how Russian regime is built, you might get an answer that those funds are the cleanest in the world. And then your case might fail in that regard. Now, with the new non-conviction-based confiscation requirement in place, that can be made easier. If, for example, funds belonging to, through an offshore company, belonging to Russian oligarch are sitting somewhere in a bank account in the European Union, and there are signs and indicators that this money might be actually of criminal origin because the flow of funds in that bank account corresponds to certain money laundering typologies, then confiscating that money through non-conviction-based confiscation system, not convicting, but proving that the money is of illicit origin, can be easier. And Latvia is an example of that. We have a non-conviction-based confiscation system that was recently tested in our constitutional court because, again, there's risks to the right of property, and such legal frameworks will be tested in constitutional courts, but they are possible. Common law jurisdictions have developed them very, very well, especially the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand as well, I think. So this certainly is the way forward to make it easier, but still legally sound, to confiscate funds of oligarchs, not just from Russia, who have gotten their money illegally and are using our financial system in illegal ways. Thank you.
Thank you. For the left, Cesar Ramo.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the information. I believe that Russian state and all its oligarchs must pay for the destruction they caused in Ukraine. That's clear. I guess most of us here agree. And of course, we must ensure that we do not turn into a bandit regime ourselves. And we must also not sacrifice the credibility of the euro currency. That would only benefit Trump and Putin, not Ukraine. But things we can do easily, I think, are the most acute. What Mr. Heinäluoma mentioned was the anti-money laundering lists. And because we know most of the money laundering from the Russian oligarchs, it doesn't go through Moscow, but it goes through Dubai. And now when we made it easier for Russian money flows to the Russians to launder money when we delisted Arab Emirates. So my question is, do we have new ways to counter these money flows? And what kind of other things we could do more now to make it harder for the Russians to launder money and to the regime and its supporter oligarchs to cope? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the question. I probably should have said it last time that the listing of Russia on the AML list will be in many ways a symbolic gesture from our side, because European banks are already subject to a transaction ban vis-a-vis a lot of the entities that you're talking about. So, sorry, but again, in Dubai, this would require us to be extraterritorial in our sanctions, and this principle is not there. So we do not impose our sanctions on entities outside of the EU. Within the EU, we have a transaction ban, which in a sense covers the AML point within the EU. But we do not apply our AML law either, by the way, extraterritorial, only to the EU. So this is the only answer I can give you on this, is that we already have in place what we need to manage AML from the EU AML framework perspective. Of course, listing would be a powerful signal as well, but that requires us to build a case that shows that they are somehow in breach of AML laws within the AML framework. But as I said, it's a largely symbolic thing, because from the EU AML framework, we've already achieved the objective through the transaction bans we put in place under the sanctions law. And as for Dubai, as I said, this will be extraterritorial application, and this is something we have not, at least at this point, chosen to do.
Yes, thank you for your question. In anti-money laundering world and in sanctions implementation world, the primary role, the first gatekeeper, is the private sector. And in both cases, mostly we're talking about financial sector. And financial sector is very well versed in detecting suspicious patterns and suspicious transactions. And the legal framework to detect them and to report them to financial intelligence unit of their respective countries is also there. Now with the new anti-money laundering package, both the regulation and directive and the establishment of the anti-money laundering authority in Frankfurt, I presume, and it should be the case, that our anti-money laundering framework gets even better over time, and there is more homogeneity across the European Union member states and how their financial intelligence units are resourced, how many powers they have, how law enforcement authorities in the countries are resourced. Because what we see very often is that banks spend millions and billions on their compliance systems, on their machine learning systems, to report suspicious transactions into their financial intelligence units, but there is so much data later in the public sector authorities which need to analyze those flows, then investigate, then prosecute, and then to convict. Yes, the system is there. The question is how many resources are there in the public sector to really go after all of these crimes, and how homogeneous is the anti-money laundering system and sanctions implementation system across all EU member states, the 27 member states. That would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. For ESN, Rada Lekova.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will speak in Bulgarian. Въпросът ми към Европейската комисия тук е как този нов план за отнемане на руските активи в цялост се съвместява с вече приетия механизъм, при който лихвите от тези активи се използват за обслужване на макрофинансовият заем за Украйна. И не виждате ли очевидното вътрешно противоречие? Парите вече са обещания, сега се предлага да се изземат изцяло. Дори Политико иронично нарича идеята правно-креативна. Цитирам: Европейския съюз предлага креативен нов начин да изпрати милиарди евро от замразени руски активи на Украйна. Всички знаем, че шансът Украйна сама да изплати този заем или да получи репарация е минимален, и това означава, че тежестта ще падне върху държавите членки, т.е. върху европейските граждани. И в двата случая Европейския съюз губи доверието на инвеститорите, също и тежестта получава за данъкоплатците. Искам да попитам как оправдавате подобно решение и кой конкретно в Европейската комисия носи отговорност за разработването и подновяването на тези идеи. Кои дирекции, кои комисари стоят за този план? Защото този план подкопава доверието към Европа като място за инвестиции. Много често говорим за конкурентоспособност, за нуждата от инвестиции и не само. Той натоварва и собствените и граждани с още дългове, така че кой носи отговорност пред европейските граждани за тези планове?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, and thank you again for the question. Let me be very clear. There was it may have been a translation issue, but there was a reference to confiscation. These assets will not be confiscated. Okay, so let's be very, very clear. The idea here, as I said, is to mobilize these assets without changing the ownership. So the ownership remains with the Central Bank of Russia. And that's important because then we can mobilize the assets, but in consistency with international law. I am not the service responsible for doing this. This is being, ultimately the Commission is one body, so it is the Commission itself that is responsible. Within the Commission, this is being done not by DG FISMA, by DG ECFIN and others. But in the end, it will be adopted by the Commission, so it will be a Commission responsibility. And of course, I take the point that we have to do this in a way that is consistent with international law, because we do not want to undermine confidence in the euro system. That is why, I think I said at the beginning, we have to be careful here, because whatever we may feel about the specifics of this case, it will be generally applicable, whatever we do, and others will take a view that irrespective of who is the target of this action now, they could be the target in the future. And so this is important. But we are taking that into account. And I do not think we are behaving in any way that's irresponsible. I think the President has been clear. We need to mobilize these assets. Russia has started this war. Russia should pay for this war. And therefore, we're going to mobilize the assets, but we're going to mobilize them in such a way that is not going to undermine Europe's position vis-à-vis international law. Thank you.
Okay, for EPP, Janusz Lewandowski.
Thank you. Good morning. World Bank has recently updated the reconstruction needs of Ukraine for more than $500 billion. More pressing are financial gaps annual, estimated in Kiev at more or less 40 billion this year and next year. We, European Union, we are the biggest donor, depending on loans, not likely to be repaid. Therefore, we should be most interested in making Russia to pay for damage and not the victim, not the taxpayers of the European Union. Ukraine deserves really, here is personal note, I am a living memory of 2 decades wasted of independence in Ukraine. I was sent to Kiev by World Bank, coming back depressed, but now I am really impressed. Under the extreme conditions, they are really improving their state, spending 60% of budget on defense and internal security. This is the result of a recent study on implementation of Ukraine facility. We are imposing conditionality on a country that is in state of war. Therefore, this direction and a solution discussed in Commission, also confirmed by Director Berrigan, is a positive direction. This is not confiscation. This is limiting, therefore, legal risks. I understand all the concerns, but so far the freezing is not producing flight of investors. And in very brutal legislation in US is not really undermining dollar. My all questions were already asked and answered. Perhaps to put it a little bit differently, whether Commission is already in a dialogue with ECB of how to balance the protection of credibility of euro with this need to use frozen assets. And perhaps additional question, could, as a solution, substitution of cash with EU bonds could eventually risk hidden liabilities or permanent, never-ending cycle of rollovers? More technical question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the questions. I mean, just to come back and say that, I mean, in a way, this is what the President has been saying, that this is Russia's war, Russia should pay. The EU will make a loan, it will be collateralized by these assets. Ukraine will only repay the loan if they receive reparations from Russia. Otherwise, the assets remain immobilized and Ukraine and the EU do not pay. So those assets, so this is linking as has always been the case, linking the ultimate release of these assets to reparations paid by Russia after the war. ECB, we are in a continuous dialogue with the ECB, and they have made their position very clear from the outset. And I think, as I said, it is a position that people have listened to because we do not want to be in any way inconsistent with international law. And that's why we are, and I do not want to go into detail, which is why I'm not going to answer your second question as well on this, because I do not go into detail of this proposal now because it's still under preparation and I'm not really in a position to do that. But just to be aware that one of the reasons we're doing this is because we do want to take account of the ECB's concerns, which are there, and they continue to voice them, and they're entitled to do so because it is a valid point. We have to be careful that whatever we do with respect to Russia does not have general, or is not seen as having general applicability, and therefore might undermine the broader confidence in the euro area and the international financial system as a whole. But their views are well taken into account. The technical detail I will come back to later when I have the technical details myself in front of me, but I don't want to go in there now because it's not my position to talk about that until the President has the chance to make the proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yankov. No? The S&D, Rowena Loma.
Thank you. First, I still would like to a little bit continue the discussion on the listing Russia on the high-risk third countries list. And as we remember, this was really part of the discussion during summer. And when Parliament accepted the Commission Delegated Act on the high-risk third countries, we got the information that the Commission is preparing this decision. I would just like to hear once more that is the timetable the same which was discussed during summer before the end of the year. So can we wait the Commission proposals and evaluation of the situation before the end of the year? Then I still have two questions in my mind. And the first one is concerning the sanctions. We all know that they are effective if all the loopholes are closed. And also from the AML package, we all know that some of EU member states are quite popular destinations for Russian oligarchs, which have been mentioned here several times. Hit by the sanction list, these oligarchs, they are still set up businesses and continue to operate in the European Union, often also helped by a very liberal passport policies in these countries. We know that member states have to set up a national sanction implementation unit in this regard. I would be interested to hear, have all member states done this as they have promised? If not, which one have not done it? And will the Commission take further action towards member states facilitating Russian oligarchs' businesses practices? And then one question still, and that goes to the cryptocurrencies. What's the evaluation of the Commission concerning the use of cryptocurrencies? Is there a risk that the cryptocurrencies are more and more used in a way to circumvent the sanctions? And do we have any statistics on this item?
Thank you. Commission.
Thank you. On the deadline, I can say, yes, the deadline is the same. So whatever I think is what my commissioner said here holds. So we are still working on it. Two things here, just to clarify, in case there's any confusion. There are two possible listings here. One is a FATF listing, which we need to get the support of other FATF members, and we have been trying, but it's not so straightforward because there's a block of people in FATF who are not supporting this. There is, of course, the possibility for us to go on our own list, which is what we were discussing before, and that is what we're working on. But we still have to build the same case we would build in the FATF context to do that, okay? So that it is legally sound within our own framework. And that requires quite a bit of work, and we have to prove that they have actually breached along certain rules. And remember, prior to the suspension from FATF, they were not listed in FATF. They had, in fact, if I remember just rightly, they had gone through an examination by FATF and had come out of it rather well. So we have to build that case, and that's what the work is underway. The national sanctions implementation, I will have to check on this to see exactly who has and who has not done this, and I can come back to you. I cannot today give you the numbers on that. What I will say here is that the Commission is aware that there's an implementation issue around sanctions, but we need to understand that we have gone from almost zero to maximum capacity in a very short space of time. When I took over the sanctions file back in whatever it was, 2020, this was a very small operation. It has now become a very big operation in Europe. The member states have had the same process we have had. They have to go from very low level to very, very high capacity output in a very short period of time. So implementation, yes, we need to work on that. We need lots of things in implementation, But actually, we're also in the process of imposing more and more sanctions through packages. Now 19 packages over 3 years. So it's quite a rhythm. So I think we have to be a little bit realistic here and understand that the member states like us are having to resource this, they're having to organize this, while at the same time implement pretty aggressive and pretty large scoped packages. So we accept there is an issue of implementation. I think I would love to have a moment of calm so we can all sit down and talk about how we can do that better. But we are not in a moment of calm, we're in a moment of continuously ramping up the pressure on Russia through sanctions. But yes, there is an issue of implementation, and we need to work on it, and I think it's a valid point. On cryptocurrencies, very early on, cryptocurrencies were identified as one of those areas where you may be able to circumvent sanctions. We put certain sanctions on cryptocurrencies in the very early packages, but we are keeping an eye on this to see to what extent it is being used. I mean, to be fair, cryptocurrencies are a more general issue around money laundering, and not just for Russia. It's a more general issue about cryptocurrencies, the possibilities to use them for these purposes. So it's not a uniquely sanctions issue, but we are keeping an eye on that area in specifically related to sanctions.
Thank you. Now I will give the floor to... Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Madam. Yes, on Russian oligarchs and national competent authorities, I also don't have information on exactly how many countries have established their specific dedicated national competent authorities, but each of the countries have some sort of sanctions implementation mechanism, sometimes very decentralized. What we have found in Latvia, that very centralized model works best, where we work with our customs very closely as well, and with our policymaker, which is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. For example, in 2024, when Latvia designated us as a national competent authority, we were given additional 19 new staff positions, expanding powers and responsibilities so that we can really perform our functions to the best possible extent, and it has achieved very significant results. On Russian oligarchs operating in the European Union, I believe that if they are listed, for listed Russian oligarchs, it would be very difficult to operate within the European Union, irrespective of how liberally or conservatively that particular member state implements sanctions. I don't think it would be very possible. And in Latvia, we can account for each cent frozen to an oligarch in Latvia, and if they have any operations, those are seized and remain to the minimum possible extent. What is happening sometimes is we see divergences in implementation, and sometimes it happens with big companies, with groups of companies which have subsidiaries across EU member states and are ultimately controlled by certain Russian oligarch, for example. And that element of control is sometimes interpreted differently by member states. And then ultimately, those subsidiaries in one country, they are deemed completely frozen and they cannot operate, but in another member state, they continue to operate. And we see some high-profile cases like that. And the problem is that ultimately, on the EU level, there is no final arbiter who would say which is the correct approach. It is sanctioned or it is not sanctioned. The European Union, the European Commission, unfortunately, does not have that power to give the authoritative guidance. What I would propose potentially is to vest that power with the newly established anti-money laundering authority. So in Latvia, we do that. If I see two banks freezing funds of one and the same company in a different way, one is freezing and one is not freezing, we would tell in Latvia what to do. But I cannot tell any other member state what to do. So on the EU level, to have such an arbiter would probably be a good idea to ensure that this implementation is uniform, and in the same cases, we apply sanctions similarly. About the crypto asset service providers, I can again speak about Latvia. And our crypto asset service provider environment hasn't been very well developed thus far. But with the adoption of the markets and crypto assets regulation, which is rather recent, we believe that the licensing processes across the European Union member states for different crypto asset service providers will be given. They are subject to anti-money laundering requirements. They are subject to sanctions compliance requirements. There are specific type of crypto asset-related sanctions. For example, European registered crypto asset service providers cannot provide services to Russian nationals at all. So we know it is a problem that Russians might try to evade sanctions through crypto assets. There is a rather low probability that EU-registered crypto asset service providers will be used for that purpose because there is a blanket prohibition to do that. But if the European Union knows that Russian nationals are using foreign registered crypto asset service providers to evade EU sanctions, the European Union now potentially under 19th sanctions package, as we heard in European Commission's President's address, that those might be targeted. And we think these sort of further sanctions in the financial sanctions toolkit of the European Union to target third country financial institutions or crypto asset service providers could provide significant impacts and results. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the vice chair of the INTA committee and the INTA standing rapporteur for Ukraine, Ms. Karine Kazbro.
Thank you, Chair. Here I am. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for an excellent hearing and for the very, very interesting presentations. First of all, it has to be said, Russia is a terror state. Russia breaks the most fundamental principle of international law. It's Russia's war. Russia must pay for it. Simple like that. And Putin has a budget. The Russian economy is only 12% of the EU member states' economies. So, by sanctions, we do press Russia and we can do much more, smarter and better. So, it's so important that we evaluate and have these kind of discussions. And I think that after 19 sanction packages, we can still do much more. I led the negotiations in the European Parliament and the INTA committee when we adopted the exceptional MFA and the ULCM mechanism. And it has been very interesting to follow the developments regarding how the EU can use the frozen Russian assets, especially in recent times. When we discussed the use of the frozen Russian assets last year, much of the debate revolved around the fact that our G7 partners were very keen in extending the sanctions period from the current 6 months. So, is it still being discussed, and what are the options for the EU regarding the ERA loan and proposed new mechanism if a member state decides to use its veto against the sanctions? Another question concerns Switzerland and Switzerland's participation in the ERA initiative. If I'm not mistaken, the frozen assets in Switzerland are not currently being used to support Ukraine. How can we bring Switzerland on board? Had the Commission already taken any initiatives? And especially given that earlier this year it became clear that more frozen assets were held in Switzerland than we previously know about. So these are my questions, and once again, thank you so much for arranging this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Commission.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again for the question. Actually, it's a good point, and I should have made, and I think I made it in my introduction, but I have maybe not stressed it enough, that a lot of what we do here is in the context of the G7, and it is part of an international consensus to work. On the 6 months, you'll probably be aware that we managed, in the specific context of the immobilized assets, to lengthen that period. So that has been somewhat lengthened. That was one of the, as you rightly said, one of the asks of our partners in relation to the ERA loan. We are, again, I do not want to go into the details of the proposal which is currently under considerations, but of course we are always aware that the sanctions are renewable after certain periods of time, 6 months or beyond, depending on the asset concerned. So this is something we have to take into account, and we will take it into account in this new proposal. Switzerland, well, we work very closely with Switzerland. We have a long-standing relationship with Switzerland in any case, and in this particular context, it has been very, very close. But in the end, of course, we cannot force things on our partners that they're not willing to do. So we are in touch, we are in contact with them. They know our position on this. But in the end, of course, they're a G7 partner. They're not in the union, and there's not much we can do beyond that, other than urge them to take account of our position on these things. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know if you want to say, Enika GIs, more question? Yes, 1 minute? 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will again speak in Bulgarian. Доколкото разбирам, казвате, че руските активи не се конфискуват, само се мобилизират. А за това нека дам един прост пример. Представете си, че аз отида в банката и мобилизирам мебелите от моя офис в Европейския парламент, за да обезпеча един заем, който искам да взема. Тези мебели не са моя собственост. След това ги изпращам в България, защото много граждани в България не са доволни от политиката на Европейския съюз в момента, за да им помогна. Но им поставям условие, че трябва да върнат тези пари, само ако спечелят, например, от лотария. И всяка една банка ще каже, че това е напълно нелегално и незаконно, защото е забранено да залагаш имущество, което не е твое. Забранено е да мобилизираш нещо, което не е твое. А вашия план изглежда, че иска да обезпечите дълга с активи, които не принадлежат на Европейския съюз. И затова искам да ви попитам каква е разликата между този хипотетичен, опростен план, който аз изложих, и вашето предложение. Благодаря.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think as the Commissioner, as the President has made clear, there will need to be European guarantees involved here. So it is not the analogy you have just drawn is not a perfect analogy here by any means. The ownership of these assets will remain with Russia. The loan will be made by the European Union using these assets as a form of collateral against a guarantee. Ukraine will only repay that loan if Russia makes reparations. Europe will therefore receive its money back if Russia pays reparations to Ukraine. Otherwise, these assets remain immobilized here as the collateral against the European loan. So it is not the analogy of your furniture. This is actually in consistency with international law, because the assets remain in the ownership of the Central Bank of Russia, but they can be mobilized using these guarantees from the European side. The issue is not really about where they move or don't move, it's about repayment. And the loan will be repaid either through Russian reparations, or it will remain outstanding, backed by the collateral of these assets, which remain in Russia, but as I said, it's getting really complicated, but it is the guarantee that the European Union will give that makes it possible to make this loan without pledging somebody else's collateral, okay? Again, I don't want to go into too much detail on this because, as I said, this is something that I am not responsible for, and it is being worked out as we speak. So perhaps it's better to let the details be decided, and then we can come back, because there are a bunch of issues that have to be looked at. But the fundamental point that the President has made is that we can mobilize these assets consistent with international law, and that the ownership will not be changed. I mentioned earlier, and I should have come back on these national implementation, these national sanctions units. I am told that by law, they all exist. So I could tell you they're already there, but we know that some member states have not managed to kind of operationalize them in terms of centralizing sanctions control. We're dealing with those. I still am not sure how many of those member states. I am just informed that we are dealing bilaterally with them. But de jure, they all have established them under law. They're not all operational yet. So that's perhaps the more important point there. Thank you.
Thank you. More question? No? Maybe you want the floor for some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can be very brief. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to come here. It's always important to hear the views of the Parliament on these issues. As I said at the beginning, we have now implemented 18 packages and will very soon put in place the 19th package. You will see that certainly these packages have become bigger and broader in scope as we have gone along. They are having an effect. Sanctions are they're slow burners. They're not things that affect immediately, but they progressively impact over time. And I think we can see in terms of the numbers coming out of the Russian economy that they are impacting over time. So they are important. And so it's important that we continue to have your support for this effort. On the assets, as I've explained to you, you must distinguish between private and public. On private, this is a matter of not really sanctions law. It's a matter of criminal law, whether you can confiscate these assets or not. We cannot do this under sanctions law. As has been pointed out, there have been improvements to how it can be managed under criminal law, but without criminal legal proceedings and due process, it's not possible to just confiscate these directly under sanctions law. And on the Russian sovereign assets, as I said, we have this issue of consistency with international law. It is an important point for many members of the Union, but also our G7 partners. So what we are doing is working on a proposal that will allow us to mobilize the assets more fully, but remaining consistent with international law. I think that's what the proposal we're working on now hopes to do. And the President has indicated that she will bring that forward before the end of the year. And I will leave it for her to do that and not speculate too much in advance what will be in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Iliakov.
So, thank you. We would just like to reiterate that EU's financial sanctions measures are strong. The 19th sanctions package is upcoming. What probably needs to be done is to reevaluate the effectiveness of all types of sanctions that have been imposed, because 19th sanctions packages, they put a toll on those who must implement them. And most importantly, I'm talking about compliance officers, usual trade-related businesses that have to implement them, financial institutions. They take a lot of resource to implement all of them. And if some particular types of sanctions are not effective, we should be honest about it and put the pressure on the measures which are the most effective. And EU sanctions are effective. And if we're talking about financial sanctions, the results achieved have been rather remarkable, and the European Union is on the way of getting them even stronger and stronger. But the most important point is, irrespective of how strong our sanctions are on paper when they are imposed, the most important part is how they are implemented. And they are implemented on the very day-to-day level by regular businesses who are engaged in imports and exports, by financial institutions who must implement them, who are guarding the integrity of our financial system. And as long as they're implemented coherently across the EU member states, I think that's the most important point what we should focus on. And when sanctions circumvention or sanctions violation occurs, and they do occur, we must be very stringent about penalizing those who are engaged in this illicit behavior, which in the end ultimately helps Russia to wage its war of aggression against Ukraine. So the consequences has to be very severe for violations of sanctions. That's our final remarks. Thank you.
Merci. Merci à toutes et à tous. Je voudrais tout d'abord vous dire à quel point je trouve que cette audition, elle a été du côté du Parlement européen d'un excellent niveau, et je partage tout à fait ce que la vice-présidente de la commission INTA a dit à ce sujet. Je pense aussi que vous entendez que du côté du Parlement européen, il y a un soutien très clair à l'Ukraine et qu'il y a tout de même une inquiétude sur le caractère efficace et des sanctions. Et c'est pour ça que vous avez régulièrement un très grand nombre de questions qui vont dans le même sens, sur la question notamment des frozen assets, même si on comprend par ailleurs la question de la stabilité financière et la question du respect de la règle de droit, mais la règle de droit, elle doit être aussi respectée et les frontières aussi doivent être respectées. Voilà, donc je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de discussions encore à avoir sur ce sujet-là. La question des compétences nationales aussi est aussi revenue beaucoup lors de cette audition, ce qui donne encore plus de crédit au rapport Draghi, qu'on mentionne souvent quand il s'agit de la question de la simplification, par exemple, mais dont on oublie assez la question, par exemple, de l'harmonisation finalement au niveau européen, d'utilisation de la régulation plutôt que des directives. Et donc, le rapport Draghi, qui était un rapport finalement de compromis, je pense, entre les différentes forces politiques, doit être définitivement vraiment mis en place au niveau européen dans son entièreté et pas seulement sur quelques parties. Et puis a été fait mention également des cryptos. Et là, je tiens à rappeler, en citant Gary Gensler, dont on se rappelle, et qui avait fait, je pense, le discours le plus juste et qui comprenait le mieux ce qu'étaient les cryptos et les stablecoins, et rappelait que notamment les stablecoins étaient utilisés très massivement aussi pour déplacer de l'argent issu des cryptos. Donc quand on parle des cryptos, il faut aussi avoir une réglementation serrée derrière la question des stables qui revient beaucoup aujourd'hui dans le débat politique. En tout cas, je voudrais remercier nos deux invités qui ont répondu à toutes les questions et vraiment remercier à la fois le comité INTA de sa présence et les membres de la commission des affaires économiques et monétaires pour la qualité et des questions et leur mobilisation. Je me permets également de remercier les interprètes et le secrétariat parce que nous avons eu une semaine assez intense avec 3 trilogues dont un conclusif, entre autres choses, entre les votes, entre les hearings et entre la préparation au dialogue monétaire que nous allons avoir tout à l'heure. Donc je voudrais vraiment vous remercier infiniment. Merci à toutes et à tous et bonne journée.